The most heartbreaking murder story you will ever hear. True crime. Documentary. The story of Marilyn Gandert is not just about crime. It is about trust, and how trust, when betrayed, becomes the deepest wound. Marilyn was not a public figure. She was a grandmother, a sister, a friend, a woman whose life had already been shaped by loss, yet who carried on with quiet resilience. She buried her husband, she buried her son, and still she endured. Her ending was not written by strangers. It was written by those closest to her, her daughter-in-law, her grandson, and his friend. People she for detectives. The case was unforgettable not for its brutality, but for its intimacy, for the fact that family became predator. For those left behind, her brother Harry, her friend Nancy, her neighbors, the grief lives on not just in what was taken, but in how it opened her door to people she loved. The betrayal was intimate, devastating, and final. Was taken. In court, justice was measured by prison years. In life, grief is measured differently. In silence at dinner tables, in birthdays uncelebrated, in the unending ache of absence. This is the story of Marilyn Gandert, a woman who deserved peace but was given betrayal. At the final footage, we tell her story not to sensationalize but to remember, to honor, to ensure she is never forgotten. The house was quiet. Too quiet. On the edge of Albuquerque, neighbors described Marilyn Gandert's home as ordinary. A single-story house, white siding, with a rose bush that still bloomed stubbornly each spring. It was the kind of home you'd pass without a second thought, the kind of home you'd assume was filled with safety. But behind those walls, trust was breaking. And within days, that home would become the scene of a betrayal so unthinkable that even seasoned detectives struggled to make sense of it. Marilyn was a grandmother, known for her steadiness, her quiet resilience. To those who loved her, she was the definition of dependable. And yet, the very people she cared for most would turn that trust into something sharp, something final. This is not just a story about crime. It's a story about betrayal at its most intimate level. A story about family turned against family, love turned into violence, trust turned into tragedy. It is a story that forces us to ask, how well do we ever really know the people closest to us? This is the life and the devastating death of Marilyn Gandert. Welcome to the final footage. Before tragedy entered the picture, Marilyn Gandert lived a life that many would describe as ordinary, but those who truly knew her understood that ordinary did not mean small. To her friends and family, Marilyn embodied steadiness. She was the kind of woman who could be relied upon when storms came. The kind of presence that reminded people of safety and routine in a world that often feels chaotic. Marilyn lived in Albuquerque, New Mexico, a place where desert landscapes stretch wide under blue skies, where neighborhoods carry both history and hardship. She was no stranger to loss. Her life had already been carved by grief long before her final chapter. Marilyn had buried her husband, a man she deeply loved, and later she had buried her own son. The weight of those absences would have crushed some. But Marilyn endured. She carried her grief like she carried everything. Quietly, with dignity. Her brother Harry was one of her strongest connections. He often checked on her, worried about her more than she ever let on. To Harry, Marilyn wasn't just his sister. She was a steady light in his world, someone he could trust implicitly. Their bond reflected a loyalty that ran deep, forged by both love and shared losses. Marilyn was also close with her friend Nancy, who often described her as loyal, dependable, and true. Nancy admired Marilyn's strength, the way she seemed to weather storms without complaint, the way she was always present for others even when her own heart carried scars. She was steady, Nancy would later say, the kind of person you could always count on. Her home was modest, but it reflected her, organized, welcoming, a space where others always felt safe. It was a house filled with memories, photos of her husband, mementos of her son, small details that spoke of a life lived with care and quiet perseverance. To the outside world, Marilyn may not have seemed remarkable. She wasn't chasing fame or fortune. She wasn't someone who sought recognition. Instead, her life was measured in the trust she gave, the kindness she showed, and the resilience she embodied. But that trust would prove to be her undoing. You see, Marilyn opened her home and her heart to family. Her daughter-in-law Alyssa, her grandson Drake, and his close friend Annie were part of her circle. She gave them what she could: shelter, love, acceptance. She believed in family even when it strained her. She believed in connection, even when others took advantage of it. The tragedy of Marilyn's story is not just what happened to her, but who it happened by. These were not strangers lurking in the night. They were not intruders breaking through a window. They were the people who sat at her table, who walked through her front door without knocking, who shared her bloodline and bore her trust. In the days before her murder, Marilyn's life appeared unchanged. She tended to her routines, spoke with Harry, spent time with Nancy, and moved through her world with the same steadiness that defined her. If she suspected betrayal was growing closer, she never showed it. She lived as she always had, quietly, faithfully, devoted to the people around her, and that is what makes her story so devastating. The contrast, the cruel irony of a woman who survived heartbreaks that might have broken others, only to be undone not by fate, not by strangers, but by the people she should have been safest with. Her world, though touched by grief, still carried light. She was a grandmother who should have been able to live out her days in peace, surrounded by family, comforted by memories, visited by those who loved her. That is what she deserved. That is what was taken. This is why, when investigators would later stand in Marilyn's home, piecing together the fragments of betrayal, even they would admit this case haunted them differently. Not because of its violence, but because of its intimacy. Because of the way trust, something so human, so essential, had been weaponized against a woman who embodied loyalty until the very end. And so Marilyn's story begins not with crime, but with a life built on resilience, trust, and family. A life that would be shattered by the very bonds meant to protect it. The day Marilyn Gandert's life was stolen did not arrive with a storm. It came quietly, deceptively ordinary like so many others. The morning sun stretched across Albuquerque, casting its usual warm glow on the desert floor. Neighbors went about their lives unaware that within Marilyn's modest home, a plan of betrayal was taking shape. Marilyn had no reason to suspect that danger lingered so close. She had endured so much already, the loss of her husband, the devastating grief of burying her son, yet she still found it within herself to open her door to family. That morning, her house was a familiar gathering place, as it often was. Her daughter-in-law, Alyssa, and her grandson, Drake, were part of her daily life. Alongside them was Annie, a friend of Drake's, who had become a fixture in the household. For Marilyn, this arrangement was not unusual. She'd always been giving. If someone needed a place to stay, she offered her couch or a spare bed. If someone needed food, she shared her pantry. If someone needed money, she gave what she could. Her home was her way of showing love, of holding her fractured family together. But on this day, those very bonds would be twisted into something unrecognizable. What Marilyn couldn't have known was that Alyssa, Drake and Annie were simmering in resentment and desperation. Their dependence on Marilyn had mutated into something toxic. For them, her home was no longer a gift. It was a cage, a reminder of control they resented. To Marilyn, her generosity was love. To them, it was suffocating. That fracture between perception and resentment had been growing for weeks, maybe months. And on that day, it would explode into betrayal. As the hours passed, small details marked the shift in atmosphere. Neighbors later recalled seeing Alyssa pacing outside, her face tense. One even remembered hearing raised voices from within the house, nothing unusual enough to prompt a call, but unsettling in hindsight. Inside, Marilyn moved through her routines. Perhaps she made tea as she often did. Perhaps she sat in her favorite chair, surrounded by family photos that told the story of her life. She might have smiled, unaware of the danger that was already inside her walls. At some point, the tone shifted. What began as an ordinary day descended into chaos. Words were exchanged, harsh, bitter, sharp. Accusations rose, tempers flared, and the fragile fabric of family unraveled. In that moment, Marilyn faced not strangers, but the very people she had fed, sheltered, and loved. They were not masked intruders. They were her own blood and kin. That is the cruelty of this story, the psychological violence that precedes the physical. Imagine the fear, the disbelief, the heartbreak of realizing that the people you trusted most have turned against you. We don't know every word that was said, but we do know the outcome. In a matter of moments, Marilyn's world collapsed. Her strength, her resilience, her quiet endurance, none of it could protect her from the betrayal that unfolded in her home. And when it was over, silence fell. A heavy, unnatural silence. For Alyssa, Drake, and Annie, the act was not just violent, it was final. They had not only taken Marilyn's life, they had dismantled the trust that bound their family together. For now, the betrayal was hidden. But as with all crimes, the truth could not stay buried. That day, quiet, ordinary, deceptively simple, would soon be remembered not for its sunshine, but for its shadows. It was the day trust became a weapon. The day a grandmother's love was met not with gratitude, but with cruelty. The day Marilyn Gandert's life was stolen by the very people who should have been her sanctuary. In the immediate aftermath of Marilyn's murder, her home on the quiet street in Albuquerque looked untouched from the outside. The rosebush by her porch still bloomed, neighbors still passed by without pause, and life on the surface appeared unchanged. But inside those walls, silence lingered where there should have been life. An absence so sharp, it would soon become impossible to ignore. It was Marilyn's brother, Harry, who first grew worried. He had always been protective of her, checking in often, especially after the losses she had endured. Marilyn was steady, but Harry knew her resilience came at a cost. He called, as he always did, but this time there was no answer. At first he brushed it off. Maybe she was resting, maybe she had gone out for groceries. But as the hours passed, his unease deepened. Harry wasn't alone in his concern. Nancy, Marilyn's close friend, also tried to reach her. Marilyn was dependable to a fault. She didn't just miss calls, she returned them promptly, often with a warm word or a laugh. But this time, silence echoed back. By the second day, that silence became unbearable. Harry decided to check on her in person. As he approached Marilyn's home, he felt the dread that comes when something is terribly wrong but not yet visible. The blinds were drawn. The car sat untouched in the driveway. There was no movement inside. When he knocked, there was no answer. He knocked again, louder, his voice calling her name. Still nothing. That's when Harry made the decision no sibling ever wants to make. He called the police to request a welfare check. Officers arrived and entered the home. What they found would change everything. Inside, the air was heavy, still. Family photos lined the walls, smiling faces, moments of joy captured in frames. But the life that once filled the house had been extinguished. Marilyn was gone. Her body was discovered, and the reality of betrayal came crashing into focus. Detectives quickly secured the scene. They noted that nothing appeared ransacked, nothing stolen by intruders. Instead, the home told a different story, one of familiarity. Whoever had harmed Marilyn hadn't broken in. They had been welcomed. They had been trusted. As news of her death spread, shock rippled through the community. Neighbors who had waved to her in passing, who had shared conversations over fences or at mailboxes, struggled to comprehend that such violence had occurred so close to home. For many, the idea that Marilyn, gentle, kind Marilyn, could be the target of such cruelty was unthinkable. Harry, when told the news, was inconsolable. The weight of his sister's absence hit him like a physical blow. He had worried for her for so long, and now that worry had solidified into reality. His grief was compounded by disbelief. This wasn't an accident, it wasn't natural. Someone had taken her life. Nancy, too, was devastated. She later recalled how Marilyn had been her rock, the dependable friend she could lean on no matter what. Losing her in such a brutal way felt like losing stability itself. It didn't feel real, she said. It felt like the ground had been pulled out from under all of us. For investigators, the crime scene told a story that words could barely hold. A betrayal from within. Marilyn's trust had been weaponized. The very people she had sheltered, her daughter-in-law Alyssa, her grandson Drake, and his friend Annie, were suddenly at the center of suspicion. When detectives reached out to them, their behavior immediately raised red flags. Their accounts were inconsistent. Their grief seemed performative, shallow. And as evidence mounted, it became clearer with each passing hour that Marilyn's death was not the result of strangers, but of family. But for the moment, all the community knew was loss. The discovery of Marilyn's body marked the beginning of a long journey toward truth and justice. For her family and friends, it marked the devastating end of a life defined not by crime, but by quiet resilience. The home that had once been a refuge now stood as a crime scene. The silence Harry had feared had revealed itself to be final. And for those who loved Marilyn, the question that would haunt them most began to echo. How could the people she trusted most have betrayed her in the most devastating way possible? When detectives first entered Marilyn Gandert's home, they knew immediately that this was not the work of a stranger. There were no signs of forced entry, no shattered glass, no pried open locks. The house was orderly, lived in, familiar, which made the violence at its center even more disturbing. Whoever had taken Marilyn's life had been welcomed in. They had belonged there. The case was assigned to a team of seasoned investigators with the Albuquerque Police Department, and from the beginning, the emotional weight was evident. Detectives who had seen countless crime scenes admitted later that this one carried a different kind of heaviness. not because of its brutality, but because of its intimacy. It was family, one of them said quietly. It wasn't random. That's what made it feel so unsettling. They began with the basics, a timeline. Marilyn had last been seen alive just days before her body was discovered. Calls from her brother Harry and her friend Nancy had gone unanswered. Neighbors remembered seeing her grandson Drake, his mother Alyssa, and Drake's friend Annie coming and going from the house in the days leading up to her death. These were the people closest to Marilyn. These were the people detectives would focus on first. Interviews began, and quickly, cracks appeared. When questioned, Alyssa spoke in vague terms, her answers circling without ever landing. Detectives noticed she avoided eye contact, shifting uncomfortably when Marilyn's name was mentioned. Drake was even more concerning. His demeanor swung between defensive anger and rehearsed detachment, as though he had practiced his responses but couldn't hold them steady under scrutiny. Annie, the outsider of the trio, seemed nervous, fidgeting constantly, her voice breaking in ways that suggested more than just grief. The investigators knew they were circling the truth, but they needed evidence, hard, undeniable evidence that could unravel the story of betrayal piece by piece. For a few days, investigators sifted through fragments of evidence, piecing together a puzzle that seemed, at first, almost too cruel to be true. But then came the moment every case hinges upon, the breakthrough. The shift from suspicion to certainty, the moment when shadows take shape, and the truth becomes undeniable. The turning point came not from a single revelation, but from the intersection of forensics, digital evidence, and psychology. First, the forensics. Analysts working late into the night examined the details from Marilyn's home. Fibers matched clothing associated with Alyssa and Drake. DNA samples placed Annie at the scene during the time of death. While none of these were shocking, they lived in or frequented the house. The telling detail was the way evidence aligned with inconsistencies in their statements. Their physical presence contradicted the timelines they tried to construct. Second, the digital trail. Phone records revealed that Alyssa, Drake, and Annie had been in near constant contact in the hours leading up to Marilyn's death. Text messages between them hinted at tension and plans gone unspoken in explicit terms, but clear enough to detectives trained to read between the lines. Phrases like, "We can't live like this anymore," and "something has to change tonight," weren't just venting. They were preludes. When detectives lined up these strands, the forensics, the digital trail, the footage.
Who does something like that? It's just like an animal.
When Alyssa was brought in again for questioning, she held her composure at first, insisting on her innocence. But detectives noticed the cracks. Her story repeated word for word as if rehearsed. Her tone became sharper when asked about her relationship with Marilyn. And when pressed with the fact that her phone records contradicted her timeline, her facade slipped. She folded her arms, leaned back, and muttered, "I knew this would happen." It wasn't a confession, but it was an admission of inevitability. Annie herself, fragile and anxious, was the weakest link. When confronted with Drake's partial admission, she cracked. Tears poured as she confessed details of the night, describing the escalating argument, the resentment that boiled over, the plan that had been whispered about but never, in her mind, meant to go that far. She painted a picture of three people trapped in their own bitterness, feeding off each other's anger until it turned into something irreversible, her words, while clouded by her attempts at self-preservation, gave detectives exactly what they needed, an insider's account. It tied motive, presence, and action into one narrative. With this, the breakthrough was complete. The betrayal was no longer speculation, it was fact. For detectives, there was a somber sense of victory. They had solved the case, but the feeling wasn't triumph, it was heaviness. Because unlike other cases where the breakthrough came from catching a stranger, this one carried the unbearable truth that Marilyn had died at the hands of her own. The day of the arrests dawned heavy with expectation. Detectives, armed with warrants and reinforced by the mounting evidence, prepared themselves not just for a procedural action, but for the culmination of betrayal. For weeks they had carried the weight of Marilyn Gandert's story, and now it was time to confront those accused of destroying her life. The first to be taken into custody was Alyssa, Marilyn's daughter-in-law. She was found at a small apartment complex across town, her demeanor eerily calm when officers approached. Witnesses said she didn't resist. She simply sighed, as if she had been waiting for this moment. Her hands were cuffed behind her back as neighbors looked on, stunned by the sight of a woman they had thought was simply a struggling mother. Next came Drake, Marilyn's grandson. At just 19, his face still bore the softness of youth, but the weight of his choices had hardened him. When officers cornered him outside a convenience store, he tried to play it cool, insisting he didn't do anything. But beneath his bravado, there was panic. The surveillance footage, the phone records, Annie's confession, he knew the evidence was undeniable. Finally, Annie was arrested. Unlike Alyssa and Drake, she was visibly shaken, her tears spilling as she was led into custody. By then, she had already given detectives pieces of the truth during her interviews. But now she would stand formally accused, facing consequences she could no longer avoid. At the Albuquerque Police Department, each was placed in separate interrogation rooms. The walls were gray, the air cold, the silence pressing. Detectives, steady and measured, took turns confronting them with the evidence. Alyssa remained defiant. She denied, deflected, and occasionally snapped back with anger. "You think you know everything," she sneered at one point. But detectives noted her composure cracked when the DNA results were laid before her. Her lip tightened, her eyes narrowed. She didn't admit guilt, but her silence spoke volumes. Drake, on the other hand, couldn't maintain his facade. When detectives pressed him with the surveillance video, showing him outside the house when he swore he had been asleep, his defenses collapsed. His words tumbled out in fragments. "I didn't mean... It wasn't supposed to... Annie was there too." He tried to scatter blame, painting himself as caught in the middle, but the truth was clear. He had been a central figure in his grandmother's betrayal, and Annie, fragile, guilt-ridden Annie, became the linchpin. When she sat across from detectives, her voice trembled. She admitted what had happened in halting sentences, describing the tension in the house, the bitterness that had festered, and the night it turned deadly. I thought we were just talking," she whispered. "I didn't think it would actually happen. But then it did. And I didn't stop it. Her confession didn't absolve her. But it provided prosecutors with the narrative they needed. A conspiracy, a plan formed in resentment, and an act of violence carried out not by strangers, but by family. Within days, formal charges were filed. Alyssa was charged with first-degree murder and conspiracy. Drake faced second-degree murder, conspiracy, and related charges. Annie, whose cooperation had both condemned her and lessened her role, faced charges of conspiracy and accessory. When they first appeared in court, the atmosphere was thick with grief. Reporters filled the benches, cameras captured every movement, and in the front row sat Harry, Marilyn's brother, his face a mask of sorrow and resolve. He had come to every hearing, every proceeding, determined to be the voice his sister no longer had. The defendants looked small in their orange jumpsuits, their wrists bound. Alyssa stared straight ahead, her jaw clenched. Drake shifted uncomfortably, avoiding his uncle's eyes. Annie wept softly, unable to contain her guilt. The judge read the charges aloud, the words echoing like a verdict long before the trial. Murder, conspiracy, betrayal. For the community, the arrests provided a strange mix of emotions. Relief that answers had come, devastation at the truth they confirmed. For Harry and Nancy, the arrests were not closure, but the first steps toward justice. As the hearings moved forward, prosecutors made clear their intention to pursue significant sentences. This was not just about punishment, it was about accountability. It was about honoring the life of a woman who had given everything to her family, only to have that trust shattered. And for detectives, there was no triumph in the arrests, only the quiet knowledge that they had pulled betrayal into the light. They had given Marilyn's story the dignity of truth, but truth in this case was heavier than almost any they had carried before. The arrests brought answers, but answers rarely bring peace. For those who loved Marilyn Gandert, the days, months, and eventually years after her murder were defined not only by grief, but by the unsettling weight of betrayal. The legal system could hold her killers accountable, but no sentence could repair the fracture in trust or fill the void she left behind. For Harry, Marilyn's brother, the aftermath was relentless. He had always been protective of her, checking in regularly, worrying that she carried too much of her life's sorrow alone. Now that worry had transformed into guilt. He replayed their last conversations in his mind, haunted by the thought, could I have done something more? Could I have saved her? At every court date, Harry sat in the front row, his grief visible, his loyalty unwavering. He was determined that his sister's story would be told, that her killers would not be able to erase her life with silence. Nancy, Marilyn's close friend, felt the loss in quieter but no less devastating ways. For years, Marilyn had been her steady companion, the one she could call in both joy and despair. Now, every phone call unanswered, every empty chair across the table, was a reminder of what had been taken. Nancy would later say, "It wasn't just her death that hurt. It was knowing how it happened, knowing who did it. That's what I can't make peace with." The community, too, was shaken. Neighbors who had once waved at Marilyn while watering their lawns now looked at her house with a shiver of unease. The rosebush by her porch still bloomed, but it became a haunting symbol, beauty growing beside betrayal. For many in Albuquerque, Marilyn's case was a chilling reminder that the greatest dangers sometimes come not from outside, but from within. As the legal process unfolded, emotions ran high. In court, prosecutors painted the picture of a family poisoned by resentment, of Alyssa, Drake, and Annie conspiring against the very woman. The sentences, when they came, were heavy, but not healing. Alyssa received 30 years, Drake 26, and Annie 12. For prosecutors, it was justice. For detectives, it was accountability. But for Harry and Nancy, it was only a number, years counted out against a lifetime that Marilyn should have had. "It's not enough," Harry admitted. "It never could be enough. Nothing gives her back to us." Even seasoned investigators confessed that this case stayed with them in ways others hadn't. They had seen gang violence, random killings, brutal crimes committed by strangers. But this was different. It was personal, intimate. It was a grandmother betrayed by the people she trusted most. "It shook us," one detective said. It wasn't the most violent case we'd seen, but it was one of the hardest to carry. The media coverage lingered long after the trial. Headlines framed the case as a chilling reminder of betrayal close to home. True crime forums and podcasts dissected the details, not out of morbid fascination, but out of disbelief. How could anyone turn so fully against the very person who had given them everything? In the months after sentencing, memorials were held for Marilyn. Friends and neighbors gathered, sharing stories not of how she died, but of how she lived. They remembered her loyalty, her resilience, her quiet strength. They spoke of the meals she cooked, but because of what her story says about the fragile threads of trust that bind families together. It forces us to look at the sanctuaries we take for granted, our homes, our families, our closest bonds, and ask what happens when those sanctuaries turn into shadows. Marilyn was not a headline. She was not a statistic. She was a grandmother, a sister, a friend. She was the quiet resilience that held her family together after the losses of her husband and her son. She was loyal to her brother Harry, steadfast with her friend Nancy, and faithful to the people she loved, even when they didn't deserve it. She believed in family, perhaps too much, and that belief, that loyalty, was turned against her in the cruelest way imaginable. Her story is a lesson about the dangers of dependency, about how resentment can fester in silence, about how love can be exploited when it isn't respected. But it is also a reminder of resilience, because even in the shadow of betrayal, Marilyn's life continues to speak through those who remember her, through Harry, who never stopped worrying for her, through Nancy, who continues to honor her loyalty, through the community, who refuses to let her name be reduced to tragedy alone. For investigators, Marilyn's case became unforgettable, not because of how violent it was, but because of how intimate. They were trained to face crime with detachment, to let evidence speak louder than emotion. Yet even they admitted this one haunted them, because at its core, this wasn't about strangers or faceless violence. It was about family. It was about trust turned deadly, and that is why it matters to tell her story. True crime should never be about sensationalism. It should never be about turning pain into spectacle. At the final footage, our mission is to tell these stories with empathy, with reverence, with a commitment to remembering the victims as human beings, people who laughed, who loved, who had dreams and lives that mattered. Marilyn's story deserves to be told not just for the tragedy of how it ended, but for the strength of how she lived. As we reflect on her life, we are reminded of how fragile trust can be. We are reminded of how important it is to check on the people we love, to notice when resentment festers, to reach out when silence grows heavy. Sometimes the smallest gestures, a phone call, a kind word, an act of understanding, can hold more power than we realize. Marilyn's story asks us not only to remember her, but to live more consciously in the relationships we hold. And so, as we close this journey, we carry Marilyn's light with us. We honor her not just as a victim, but as a woman who lived with loyalty, endurance, and love. We speak her name so she is not forgotten. If her story touched you, we invite you to stay with us here at the final footage. This channel is dedicated to exploring true crime with depth, empathy, and reflection. Each case we cover is more than an investigation. It is a life, a legacy, a reminder of the fragility of safety and the strength of memory. Subscribe to the final footage. Join us as we continue to tell the stories that matter, the ones that must be remembered, the ones that give voice to those who can no longer speak for themselves. Because every victim deserves more than silence. Every life deserves to be honored. And every truth, no matter how painful, deserves to be told. This has been the most heartbreaking murder story you will ever hear. This is the final footage.